Pastry was constantly considered a failure, seen as fragile and useless. Someone who spent his days trying to become a sort of Willy Wonka, molding sugar sculptures in the hopes of gaining recognition and perhaps achieving the title of confectionery royalty. However, his life took a different turn when the Lords of Isekai decided to change their plans. During one of his broadcasts in Hell Kitchen, his end came unexpectedly when one of the sculptures he had created, a massive statue, fell on his body. However, Pastry's story was far from over. He was reborn as the son of a nobleman without great resources, but with great determination. His father, Casserole, was a stubborn man who had abandoned everything to pursue an unusual dream inspired by Minecraft, to transform distant lands into a thriving village by cultivating the soil with his own hands. Through effort and stubbornness, he managed to make the farm prosper. As time passed, Pastry also grew. Zero insisted on training him with the sword on several occasions. But the boy was always distracted by thoughts of desserts and never mastered the art of combat, thus bearing the unofficial title of family disappointment. During one of these training sessions, Fuel, Casserole's loyal assistant, appeared with news. Thanks to Pastry's gardening instructions, the bean harvest had been a success. The boy was filled with joy just imagining how many treats he could make with it. Casserole, seeing such excitement, couldn't help but think that even children half his son's age were already demonstrating greater skill in agriculture. Before the conversation could continue, Fiu brought another troubling piece of news. A group of bandits was marching from Hates County, and the local forces were unable to stop them. Pastry was distressed at the thought that if those thieves reached the poor village where they lived, everything they had cultivated would be reduced to ashes, and what little they had would be left in ruins. Fuel estimated the invaders would arrive in 2 months. Casserole, however, had no intention of waiting idly by. Determined, he decided to rally the territory's workers to attack before the worst happened. He knew he couldn't ask Count Radist for help, as that kind of nobleman preferred to save face rather than admit weakness. In the capital, they would be ridiculed if they appeared incapable of protecting their own domain. As father and son discussed the risk of bankruptcy that a battle could bring, Pastry realized that his dream of recreating a real chocolate factory could completely collapse. Faced with the boy's frustration, Fuel suggested using his fury to his advantage, forcing the premature awakening of his dormant magic. To everyone's astonishment, Casserole accepted the idea of using his own son as the centerpiece of the plan, convinced there was no other way. Later, he spoke with his wife, Agnes, who initially vehemently opposed it. Her maternal instincts rebelled against such a decision, but Casserole chose her words carefully, and, after some time, managed to convince her. Agnes's more extravagant side then surfaced, and she dragged Pastry into what she called a complete makeover, involving new clothes, a neat hairstyle, and compliments from girls who found him charming. Pastry, inwardly, cursed fate for giving him 5 sisters and such a peculiar mother. Still, secretly, he admitted he somewhat enjoyed the experience. Shortly afterward, he said goodbye to his friends Luminito and Mark, while Casserole used makeshift transportation to take him to the capital. Upon arrival, Pastry couldn't take his eyes off the mountains of fruit and sweets he'd never seen before in his humble home. His father promised that, after the awakening ceremony, he could choose whatever he wanted. The boy's eyes fell on shiny, ripe apples, known in that world as bonkas. His fascination with the fruit led Casserole to wonder if his son was a strategist in disguise, while Pastry simply imagined how many pies he could make. Finally, they arrived at the church where the ritual would be performed. A strange man, agitated as if he lived on caffeine, greeted them. He was startled to see a poor nobleman seeking his son's awakening ceremony, but agreed to proceed. He placed Pastry in a restraining shirt, gave him a strange drink, and locked him in a dark, empty room. The days dragged on, and Casserole began to fear for his son, while the priest fueled the gloomy atmosphere by claiming that many went mad after so much time in the dark. However, Pastry endured the situation with surprising calm. He used the silence to imagine desserts he would make with those apples and dream of the possibility of transforming this fantastical land into a sweet kingdom at the end of its magical growth. When he awoke, he found not a charming young woman waiting for him, but rather Casserole's tired, sweaty face. Despite his initial disappointment, He was pleased to learn that his magical potential was so immense that the ritual had lasted 2 full days. He then participated in another ceremony and discovered that his ability was the extremely rare magic of replication. Pastry finally understood the benefits of what many called script armor. Casserole, excited by the discovery, began to believe that his son and his impoverished village had a chance of surviving. As they were about to leave, Casserole tried to silence the priest by offering him a bag of silver. However, the man, considering the reward small, promised to spread Pastry's legend far and wide, even if he had to scream like a madman. On their way out, Casserole bought his son a bag full of bankas, and the two swore not to tell Agnes upon their return. A few days later, in a devastated town, a group of survivors discussed the lack of food and children, while their leader, Chat, suggested attacking Casserole's village, believing it to be rich in both. Fuel took the news to the village lord, who nearly lost his temper upon learning that the bandits might arrive sooner than expected. To counter this, Casserole ordered his personal messenger to announce to the village the need to speed up preparations, fill the water reservoirs with mud in 2 of the 3 villages, and hide the crops in safe places. This would try to weaken the invaders, forcing them to focus their attacks on the village where Casserole was setting the ambush. Even Pastry, with his scattered mind, understood that his father's improvised soldiers would not withstand a real threat. Realizing this, he reflected that they needed a more solid plan. At that moment, Casserole gave him a task: to gather as many stones as possible, since it was the most viable resource given their limited ideas. The assistants quickly mobilized, while Marx du Loup boasted to Luminito that he was much stronger than Pastry. He declared himself their protector, but was quickly put in his place when Luminito demonstrated that the boy was nothing more than an unimportant extra in the situation. The discussion was interrupted by the sound of Casco approaching, closing the village gates without hesitation. Outside, the night soldiers were paralyzed with fear. It was then that Casserole took the lead and tried to galvanize them with a speech, affirming that there was no room for cowardice at that moment and that they must stand up and fight. He suggested letting the soldiers rest until dawn, believing that the enemies would only attack in sunlight, since they were unfamiliar with the terrain and lacked magical vision. However, Casserole also considered another scenario. Hungry and lacking resources, the criminals might attack them like wild beasts, even in complete darkness. Since they couldn't reach a consensus, they decided to seek the opinion of an older, respected man. He, with his experience, advised that before making any decision, more information should be gathered. Meanwhile, Casserole decided to go on a mission. He took on the role of bait and led Fuel to the criminals' hideout. Meanwhile, with Casserole absent, Pastry assumed leadership as if he were the new boss, issuing orders with the demeanor of an authoritarian executive. He reminded everyone that, even though he was only a supporting character, his father's influence would prevent surprises, and began to set a trap for the enemy, planning to launch incendiary arrows at the slightest sign of danger. Luminito was in charge of this task, while Filio used his special third-rate vision to monitor the adversaries, discovering that they were not common crooks, but skilled thieves. The criminal leader, with a smug air, explained to his accomplices what was already obvious: they're trying to lead us into a trap. However, Casserole was the first to attack them, wounding several enemies. Instead of confronting the leader directly, he opted for simple combat strategies. But when his strength was exhausted, he had to retreat toward the village, pursued by those who remained. However, it was all part of his plan. As soon as the thieves approached the village, they were surprised by the flaming arrows Pastry had prepared, tactics reminiscent of schoolboy pranks. Pastry also summoned a group of boys to throw rocks at the enemies. To everyone's surprise, the combination of ingenious tricks and determination managed to defeat most of the bandits. This, of course, enraged the gang leader. Wielding his small dagger, he invaded the village territory. Some villagers tried to restrain him but failed, and he began attacking Pastry's allies mercilessly. As he advanced toward the children, ready to hurt them, they silently reflected that the world already had enough cries and screams, and it wouldn't be fair to add to that pain. Before the villain could act, Pastry lunged at him, interrupting his plans with an unexpected technique. The bandit, however, turned the situation to his advantage and took Pastry hostage. Even so, Pastry used a duplication spell, transferring to the other thieves the sensation of a man on fire, reducing even the bravest to tears. Mark then ended the fight by hurling a rock accurately at his enemy's head. The next morning, news of Mark's injury spread, leaving Agnes in despair, but she calmed down when she discovered it was nothing serious. Pastry, alive and well, continued his quest to become village king, distributing rations to those in need. Casserole, for his part, locked the bandits in a barn, as he lacked the resources to build a prison. Short of money, he planned to send them to the county court for trial, hoping to save face and perhaps receive a reward. He then divided the remaining funds among the villagers. Mark and Luminito were thrilled to receive used clothes and a bag of expired grain. With Pastry's help, they took the gifts to Mark's house, where he felt like the best brother in the world. Finally embraced by his mother's affection for having become a local hero, Mark and Luminito took advantage of the weather to visit the barn where the bandits were being held. Feeling like heroes, they considered interrogating them, but were immediately blocked. Later, Mark devised a plan to distract the guards and managed to get inside with Luminito. They laughed at the sight of their former enemies in miserable conditions. But the situation changed when the bandits' leader noticed Mark's second-hand sword and revealed that it had been his until the previous day. Noticing Mark's ambition, the bandit offered to teach him magic, though Luminito was skeptical. Even so, Mark accepted the shortcut to gaining powers, but was soon kicked painfully. The villain escaped, retrieved his sword, and even wounded Luminito, fleeing with Mark as a hostage. The other thieves tried to escape, but were abandoned by him, who rode off on a stolen horse. Upon hearing this, Pastry rushed to check on Luminito. After confirming that she had survived, he mounted a horse and set off in pursuit. Along the way, he wondered if his leading role would be enough to defeat the enemy. Betting on the traps left in the forest, the news reached Casserole, who set out to save his son, but Phil interrupted him with speeches about politics and reputation. Meanwhile, Mark, as a last resort, used his loud, irritating voice to distract the bandit, surprising him. The two ended up trapped, and Pastry arrived at just the right moment. With his perfect timing, challenging the villain with his sword in hand, he soon realized he had no chance. But instead of fleeing, he delivered a speech about never abandoning friends, trying to muster courage even on the brink of failure. Hours later, Phil searched the forest for Pastry and found only his broken sword. Thinking he was dead, she returned home crying until she discovered Pastry was alive. Not even his mother understood how her son, considered a disaster, had achieved such a feat. She demanded an explanation, but he replied that it would be useless to explain to limited minds, as no one would understand, even in detail. Finally, he revealed that he had used his duplication magic to copy his mother's teleportation spell at the last minute. His father, overcome with jealousy, asked only that he never again disappear in front of others, especially in battle. Later, he gathered his useless followers to discuss the risk that local mining companies would try to turn Pastry into a living weapon if they discovered his ability. Meanwhile, Mark seized every moment of his own weakness as if it were a victory. Pest appeared and suggested they visit Luminito, but Mark cried, overcome with guilt for nearly letting her die. Pastry, impatient for such drama, looked at him coldly and said that tears wouldn't change anything. If he truly wanted to move the trees with their fragile branches, he would have to act like an adult. Then he grabbed him by his clothes and dragged him to Luminito's house. Pastry apologized for not being able to transform himself into a third car in that situation and hid in shame in the kitchen, immersing himself in his true passion, desserts. He thought that if life gave him lemons, he would make a lemon and apple pie. Meanwhile, Mark knelt before Luminito, begging for forgiveness. His face flushed. He asked if, after everything, she would still accept him as a partner. She remained silent, unsure of how to respond. Pastry returned, his posture erect. Holding a steaming pie in his hands, he delicately offered them both a piece, and in that moment, the painful memories and regrets seemed less heavy. The baker, ever the dramatic one, began to speak enthusiastically about the different types of apples and how each variety could transform a recipe. He compared them to people, reminding them that each had a unique role in life. In the midst of his explanation, he revealed that he still intended to recruit Mark into his future army. even if he were considered a complete failure. These words moved the young man, for the first time, he felt he had some value. Suddenly, Luminito's father appeared, oblivious to the situation, and declared that since Mark had given up his daughter, the only acceptable solution would be marriage. Luminito, still marked by the scar on her face, accepted without hesitation. She thought she was no muse, and knew she couldn't afford to turn down a suitor out of sheer pride. Mark, overcome with shame, turned red as a tomato, and everyone settled down to enjoy the pie. But his vision was cut short when yet another crisis struck the pastry kingdom. Casserole, always in a bad mood, complained that the bank account was empty and that there was absolutely nothing. And, as if that weren't enough, he accused Pastry of being responsible for the family's terrible reputation, pointing out that no one in their right mind would grant them a loan. Enraged, he cursed the pastry chef, who awkwardly suggested asking his or his wife's parents for financial help. But the situation turned out to be even worse. Pastry's father was a disastrous leader and had severed family ties after his union with Agnes wasn't approved. As he recounted his memories, he realized his two friends were more concerned with flirting than listening to him. It was at that moment that the truth dawned on him. He had been relegated to the role of third wheel. Trying to compose himself, he asked if anyone had a brilliant idea for getting rich overnight. Luminito suggested opening an apple pie shop, which excited Pastry, until he remembered he didn't even have enough money to buy apples. Mark proposed giving magic lessons, but Pastry knew that would turn him into an underpaid teacher of talentless apprentices. To provoke him, Luminito reminded Mark of the time he burned himself before even learning to control fire, calling him an idiot. Pastry felt his head throb. The arguments between them seemed endless. Then a new proposal emerged, using replication magic to work as a tattoo artist. The idea caught the pastry chef's attention. Excited, Mark and Luminito began sketching designs. But when she saw the poorly drawn dragon he had sketched, she burst out laughing. Mark, offended, told her to wait to see a real dragon, which left everyone silent for a few seconds. To avoid escalating tension, Pastry used his magic to copy the designs onto their hands. The result was surprising. Both fell in love with the tattoos instantly. Luminito, surprised, asked if he could replicate things other than drawings. At that moment, Pastry had a moment of enlightenment and called her a genius. Excited, he ran to his parents and reminded Casserole how he used teleportation magic to take Pastry's sister Josephine to parties, helping her find a wealthy husband. He then asked what families without such magical resources did. Agnes explained that they spent fortunes traveling to introduce their daughters. It was at that moment that Pastry revealed his new idea, using magical replication to create portraits of Agnes and offer them to nobles as a cheaper alternative to arranging marriages. Unable to think of anything better, Casserole loved the proposal, imagining the day he would become a millionaire at his son's expense. Agnes, in turn, asked Pastry to use magic to retouch his aging skin. But he just sighed, tired of always being used to beautify. Shortly thereafter, Pastry and Casserole traveled to Redestan to meet with the countess responsible for their bankruptcy. Upon arrival, Casserole tried to impress her, but she turned her full attention to Pastry, who was disconcerted by her terrible hair dye. Later, they sat down for tea. Pastry was delighted to see several old-world desserts, which he so loved. While Casserole lavished praise on them, the countess made it clear that none of them appealed to her refined palate, which frustrated her. The conversation turned to agricultural matters, and when given the opportunity, Casserole praised Pastry, saying he had only achieved such success thanks to him. At that moment, Pastry took the opportunity to mention that a group of bandits had destroyed his harvest and subtly hinted that he could involve the royal army. Knowing that the criminals came from the countess's own county, she tried to cover it up and denied everything, challenging them to find proof. But Casserole revealed his trump card, a superior quality sword bearing the symbol that incriminated the culprits. The cornered countess attempted to repair the damage by offering compensation. After lengthy negotiations, Pastry managed to extract 150 gold coins from her, which satisfied him, although it angered her, who realized, too late, that Pastry was truly responsible for the victories attributed to Casserole. When the Countess took her leave, she noticed that Pastry hadn't enjoyed the tea. He enthusiastically commented on the biscuits that accompanied the tea, saying they were too sweet and could be improved. Casserole, tired of hearing so much, simply apologized. Pastry also apologized, offering her a replica painting, which ended up charming the Count, making him obsessed with the work. The next day, Casserole visited Duke Cadillac's mansion for the coming-of-age celebration of Squall, the host's grandson. The young man appeared with a lost look, as if he'd had too much coffee, greeting them awkwardly. Cadillac, struggling to speak, asked them to make themselves at home and confessed to admiring Casserole's exploits. This made Pastry uncomfortable with the growing fame around him. When the ceremony ended, the nobility finally turned their attention to him, previously ignored, and were impressed by his dedication. At that moment, when his own grandson hesitated before the commission, it was considered replacing him with Pastry. The young man, who had been attracting everyone's attention, continued to amaze the Duke. Using the magic he had recently learned, he created before him the image of a young woman with delicate features and a generous body. In the celebration that followed, Squall approached Pastry curiously. "Does Petra have a preference?" Pastry calmly replied that the young woman liked certain sweets and even offered to make some. Squall, distracted, didn't catch the gist of the answer and ordered something else. "Improve the portrait, make her more attractive." The pastry chef just rolled his eyes, tired of his superficiality. That night, a group of admirers surrounded Casserole, demanding a raise. Before the situation could escalate, Pastry appeared and delivered 2 letters, one from Catholic and one from Hubert. Both contained the same news: Petra and Squall were officially engaged. As a reward for acting as the liaison, Casserole received a generous sum. Fuel, worried, suggested, "What if we use magic to teleport her?" Casserole shook his head. "It would only be possible if there were already soldiers in the capital. We don't have that kind of time." The young man proposed giving up, but Casserole was firm. "You will never have another chance to win so much. If you give up now, you will lose forever." Pastry agreed, remembering his dream of creating the land of sweets. Thinking hard, he had an idea. "What if we took Petra to the church for a magical awakening ceremony? We could leave her there for 2 days, until the engagement was announced." Casserole accepted immediately, having found no better solution. Pastry tried to leave discreetly, hoping this would serve as an apology for the funds he had embezzled from the prize. However, when his father found out about the apples and sugar he had ordered, he was unforgiving. He slapped him soundly. The next day, father and son went to Hubert's residence to escort Petra. To Pastry's surprise, it wasn't just one young woman traveling with him, but 2, as Petra had a twin sister. Petra, with a seductive demeanor, tried to charm him in exchange for more walnut cookies. Pastry, however, broke the mood by discussing the quality of the flour. In the carriage, he tried to talk to Loris, his reserved sister, but she ignored him. Petra, annoyed, reprimanded her. "Be more direct, Loris, or you'll end up getting your ear pulled. You can't live without plans." But the girl only became even more withdrawn. Pastry noticed the change when Petra stopped answering his questions. Soon after, Casserole and Hubert got into the carriage, and they all set off for the church. Disguised mercenaries followed the group, but Casserole noticed and easily defeated them. Only one escaped and tried to attack the girls, but Pastry intervened and soundly defeated him. After the confrontation, they arrived at the church. While Petra dreamed of finding Squall, Loris caught Ping's attention precisely because she was the only one not competing for his gaze. Realizing this, she regretted ignoring Pastry earlier and decided to change her stance. Later, the group gathered in a dark place to perform a spell that would take them from the small church to the capital. Meanwhile, at another location, a suspicious-looking man, resembling a dark version of Michael Jackson, made a phone call demanding a certain amount of money. Freaks received the order: kidnap a woman in exchange for 10 gold coins. The mastermind was the head of the fallen army, a resentful man. His subordinates, however, murmured, "Why would a former DK go to such lengths to regain his noble title?" The answer came from Mario, who revealed the plan: to kidnap the fiancée of the Kirk family heir and perhaps even marry her, betting that time would make her fall in love with the captor. In the end, what mattered was the money. Back at the church, Petra sighed with boredom, complaining about the lack of attention. "I can't wait to meet Squall," she said, dreaming of the portrait. Pastry, proud of his role as matchmaker, compared it all to making desserts. But his father abruptly interrupted him. Shortly afterward, Casserole ordered Pastry to accompany Loris to the guest room to make her comfortable. Naively, Pastry thought he could capitalize on the occasion. But his plans were ruined when a maid with the flu insisted on staying nearby, making the visit uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the eccentric-looking man drank wine, lost in reverie, and Petra followed her father to the royal castle after the ceremony. Pastry, meanwhile, sought ways to escape surveillance and get closer to Loris. However, a magical hole opened beneath their feet, dragging them away. Seeing this, Casserole suspected witchcraft. He ordered the Ketlock family to be notified and jumped into the hole as well, determined to protect his golden goose. Pastry woke up in a dark room, with Loris tied up beside him. He looked around, trying to understand how they had been thrown into such a sinister scenario. "What is this? A cruel act?" he thought, distraught. It was then that the kidnapper appeared, wishing him a good morning as if nothing had happened. Pastry, nervous, demanded to know the reason, but the man remained silent, hiding his intentions. Alone in his thoughts, Pastry silently wondered when he became important enough to be targeted by professional kidnappers. However, he soon realizes that the real focus isn't on him, but on Loros. He remains as irrelevant as ever, and one miscalculated move could end his life in moments. To reinforce this perception, the menacing Mario firmly warns him that it would be best not to try to appear smarter than he really is. When Serral finally crosses the hole, Loros awakens. Upon seeing Pastry, she initially believes he's come to rescue her, but the illusion quickly dispels. He explains that he's also been kidnapped and assures her that as long as he's by her side, nothing serious will happen. After all, his plot armor is impenetrable. Mario, irritated, orders Pastry to stop playing tough, stating that he'll soon be snapped like a dry twig. Even so, Pastry continues to believe that the arrogant fellow is just an imposter, and that the only one capable of using magic there is the burly Mario. Determined to play his part, he pretends to be a young nobleman in distress, complete with fake tears, all to convince the kidnapper boss that he could net over 200 gold coins. The greedy kidnapper is excited by the prospect, ordering him to stop talking too much. But Pastry insists that if the kidnapper were also a nobleman, the deal could yield even more money. His expression betrays everything, and Pastry concludes that the kidnapper is the Duke of the army. The precarious situation of the place and the old rivalry with Loros's father confirm his suspicions. To alert his useless father, he engraves a message on his clothes and sends them. Meanwhile, Casserole discovers that Loros's timid father won't send soldiers to rescue her. He's too busy currying favor with powerful figures and using his other daughter as a bargaining chip, disappointing everyone around him. To make matters worse, Mi begins to lecture him on fatherhood, as if Pastry's disappearance were irrelevant, until she receives a push from Casserole's right-hand man. At that moment, Pastry's message reaches everyone, and upon discovering that his old army rival is behind the plan, Casserole transports fuel to the capital and sets off alone to rescue his son. The kidnapper, realizing he's kidnapped the wrong sister, returns furious and nearly attacks Loros. Pastry positions himself between them, trying to play the hero to impress her, and ends up getting beaten. With Pastry down, the kidnapper raises his sword to finish Loros off. But she summons the boy with the power of her cries. He gets up and warns the kidnapper never to touch her again. Cornered, Mario calculates the strength Pastry could use to defeat him and thwart his attack. Seeing there's no way to win, he tries to escape, but Casserole blocks his exit. In desperation, Mario runs for reinforcements, only to come across Pastry's father. Cornered again, he activates a useless ability, opens another hole, and escapes. After reflecting that where there's a hole, there's always a hard road, Pastry endures a disappointing night with his father and his potential future wife. Two other weaklings appear, further frustrating Pastry. One of them grabs Loros, promising to return her to her dead father. Later, it's revealed that the army has been captured, and Casserole explains that he lost his title 20 years earlier when he was caught betraying military secrets to the enemy. At that moment, subordinates demand a report, and Casserole responds grudgingly before fleeing with Pastry in pursuit of the bandit. Back at the ruined mansion, Pastry finally realizes that Humped Dumped never had enough magical energy to escape the neighborhood. He was just a coward dressed as a villain. Upon returning to his room, he discovers that the enemy was hiding there all along with his father and son. The villain commends Pastry for uncovering the plan and draws his sword to attack them both simultaneously. Pastry offers to fight a fair, one-on-one duel. Mario, with malicious intent, attempts to strike him in a single blow, but the sword breaks when Pastry bites it. As if he were a guardian of the heavy pot, he holds the broken weapon and mentally thanks Mario for not giving up his genes, especially when he realizes that the enemy had copied the cracks in the sword to try to win. A month later, after Squall and Petra have become good friends, Pastry attends their wedding and takes the opportunity to question Duke Kodok about false information sent to the kidnappers about the girl's appearance. He suspected the Duke was trying to eliminate the threat posed by the resurrection of the House Army. Although the Duke denies it, Pastry knows he is the true traitor and uses the information to obtain more money, threatening to reveal everything to Duke Hubert by mistake. Angered, Kodok agrees to help and admits his mistake, cursing Pastry's cunning and manipulation. Duke Hubert soon appears, thanking Pastry for resolving the confusion and curiously asking if he has anyone special in his life. Pastry wonders why a man his age cares so much about his non-existent love life. He replies that he's still young for such matters, but the Duke suggests he get engaged to Loris before another woman comes along. The adults present are embarrassed, and Pastry tries to argue that Loris deserved better. When the Duke asks if it's because of some disability in his daughter's life, Pastry chooses to remain silent to protect his new chance. Even his father approves of the engagement. The people around him begin to laugh and joke about the situation, causing Pastry to lose faith in people. Later, Loris greets Pastry and thanks him for saving her, sparking an unexpected attraction in him. Squall and Petra joke about paying homage to Troy, but Pastry nervously declines. After so much flattery, he wishes to be alone, but Loris insists on his presence, seeking attention. To reassure her, Pastry assures her that she values their friendship. She tries to win him over by offering her famous cookies, but he notices she's added salt instead of sugar. Even so, Pastry eats them good-naturedly and compliments the taste, making Loris smile genuinely as the sun sets. He promises to protect Loros forever. Meanwhile, Casserole faces his worst nightmare and talks to Agnes, who, confused, misunderstands him, believing he's involved with some rich girl. She only realizes her mistake when he mentions Pastry's engagement. Becoming extremely embarrassed, to escape the situation, Casserole runs off with Pastry, unaware that Agnes was already a fan and was planning to groom the Duke's next bride. Ress, meanwhile, receives the news of Pastry's engagement and is furious that he's with a seemingly irrelevant girl, nearly losing control, but then composes herself and accepts the situation. Pastry discovered that Loris was the daughter of the Hubert family and realized that Hubert had orchestrated the entire scheme to maximize his talents. His assistant thought he was exaggerating, but Rest explained in detail how Pastry had transformed a previously barren and unproductive land into a source of income thanks to his creativity and dedication. He concluded that Hubert must have been pleased with the results. Meanwhile, the real villain of the story was celebrating his profits after blackmailing Cadlac. His friends, always hungry, showed up curious to see what he had prepared, but instead of apple pies, they found only trees. Luminito questioned whether he intended to feed everyone pies made from trees, but Pastry explained that the trees were to attract bees and produce honey. Meanwhile, Casserole and Fuel counted the money they had saved throughout the year and realized that, after 20 years of failure, they had finally made a small profit. Ciro praised Pastry, calling him a blessing sent from God, and thanked Fuel for sticking by him, even though he was considered useless. Fuel, in turn, said it was too early to celebrate, as Villanova was still under construction and more than 40 people were about to arrive. To complicate matters further, he told them that Pastry was arriving with his partners, ready to cause more trouble. Casserole cursed the day he accepted this situation, while the troubled child, now with Saitama-style hair, began using the mountains as a punching bag, imitating the magic of the evil Mario. He continued until he managed to open a water reservoir, explaining that when it rained, the ditch would store water to supply the trees they would plant around it. Pastry began to daydream, imagining how quickly he could transform this region into his own sugarland. But Mark interrupted his thoughts, drawing his attention to a raging casserole. Meanwhile, the Queen of Intrigue complained that none of them were young enough to applaud. Pastry hadn't even been arrested, so she continued drinking tea, trying to prove that age was just a number and that she needed to be in the picture somehow. A few days later, when Pastry had already established a functioning channel for the village and become a minor celebrity, he received a letter that his sister thought was from his fiancée. He was filled with hope, but the letter held a surprise. It was an invitation to a tea party. Pastry was intrigued, wondering why his sister was suddenly making such a strange move. Later, he returned home to Bullfield, his usual arrogant self, to discover that his father, a nomad, was leaving for the capital once again. As he tried to explain the strange situation about resupplying the city, the saucepan suddenly appeared, almost like a ghost, advising him not to worry about women who would only cause trouble, like prison, but to focus instead on those who could make him rich, like his own fiancée. He suddenly realized that Saucepan would be staying with them for a while. Meanwhile, rumors about Pastry's fiancée spread quickly until they reached Luminito, who imagined an older, confident, and curvy woman who completely controlled Pastry, quite the opposite of what happened. The real Pastry took Luminito to his secret retreat, which wasn't his bedroom, but the kitchen, where he prepared his favorite pastries. Meanwhile, Hubert's subordinate questioned why he had sent his daughter to the poor village of Casserole, even without an official engagement to Pastry. The conspirator explained that he had done so to prevent any approach from the Queen of Schemes and, suspecting a possible war with the neighboring Ludars, used what little paternal love he had left to send his daughter away to safety. Loris remained in Pastry's kitchen, trying to win him over, asking questions about what he was doing. After a few silly questions about whether sugar was sugar and apples were apples, she learned that Pastry was so broke he could barely afford a kilo of apples and had to give up his allowance to feed a woman. When the dough was finally ready, Pastry spread a sweet syrup over it with a satisfied smile, leaving Loris intrigued, as he seemed more excited by the syrup than by her presence. Gradually, the dough hardened, and simple designs emerged, reminiscent of elementary school art. Loris, like any damsel in distress, couldn't help but admire Pastry's innocence and joy. He, however, refused to engage in adult behavior with Loris, and his mother, sister, and friends, who acted like professional spies, grew increasingly frustrated with his lack of interest. Pastry was busy preparing sweet apples for Loris, as it was still too early for more serious matters. When Loris settled in, she still wasn't ready, and Pastry called his friends for a taste test, only to realize they'd been spying on him for some time. Josephine and Agnes quickly fled, leaving Mark and Luminito to face Pastry's wrath, who managed to prevent them from tasting his apples. A few days later, the big day arrived. Pastry imagined how to save the failing economy by selling all the R family's expensive furniture. But Loris's cold-ridden maid scolded him, telling him he needed to focus more on her than on sweets and money. This only made matters worse, because instead of concentrating, he found himself staring at Risa's attractive portrait, wondering why it had been placed there so blatantly. Then the Countess's mouse appeared at the bakery, greeting Pastry and leaving subtle threats about his behavior. To his surprise, it all worked, as all Pastry wanted was to promote his new business. Using Loris's noble status, he attracted everyone's attention and showed off his jar full of hard candies. Nobles, delighted with the novelty, bought everything on the spot, including the Countess's mouse, who thought he was tough but ended up completely overcome by sugar. Pastry tried to bribe the nobles to reduce taxes on sweets in exchange for free treats. But a new challenge arose at the worst possible moment, derailing his plans. A woman with juicy melons caught everyone's attention, and a jealous Loris tried to show up to threaten her and keep her away from Pastry. However, The frail boy couldn't take his eyes off the Queen of Plots and followed her when she asked for a private conversation. Pastry commented on the way R looked at him, and she explained it was because he seemed fragile around someone who used magic. Pastry didn't quite understand, especially since R had curves in all the right places, but he got straight to the point, winning R over by talking about his love of sweets and revealing that he wanted to grow the ingredients for his treats, including sugar and honey, in her village. R was incredulous, thinking it impossible in such a dry land, and feared he was planning something even bigger. So she decided to help him, leaving Pastry increasingly grateful and unsure how to reciprocate such attention. As Pastry became the talk of the town, Loris felt unexpectedly jealous and began to wonder what he could be doing with a girl as beautiful as R, compared to her own more reserved and proper self. With growing anxiety, Loris left the hallway to return to her safe haven, dreaming of making a lot of money with her sweets. Curious, Gree asked Pastry about Loris and if he had really saved her from the kidnapper. She wondered if he loved her, and although Pastry blushed bright red, he was too shy to admit it. Taking advantage of the situation, Gree hugged him from behind, pressing herself against him and telling him she wouldn't let go until he confessed his feelings. Pastry, who had never felt a girl so close, lost all confidence and began to give in. Just then, Loris appeared, thwarting Gree's plans. Realizing she'd lost her chance to be with someone and earn money, Pastry chased after Loris, who, heartbroken, was fleeing from her arrogant maid. He found her alone in the garden, crying silently. He tried to apologize, hoping to smooth things over, but she, still hurt, complained that the test had been unfair and rigged, saying she would never be good enough for him. She understood well why he so praised Ra's attributes, her body as perfect as a board. Even so, the tears wouldn't stop, and she compared herself to her beautiful and confident sister, which only increased her shyness. Without further ado, Pastry interrupted the moment and assured her he liked her exactly as she was, as if he hadn't just hugged another girl. He asked her to trust him, and despite being a bit clumsy, Loris nodded, a shy smile lighting up his face. Esty disappeared in a flash, teleporting home, while the others watched worriedly as Pastry's love life seemed to be spiraling downward. After a while, he returned, and Loris, expecting flowers, was surprised to see him bringing one of his famous candied apples. He explained he'd made it especially for her, with a small heart carved into the fruit. Tired of his obsession with sweets, she gave up complaining and took a bite, remembering the first time they were together in the kitchen. The memories brought tears to her eyes, and he explained that those sweet apples were also called candy apples, showing all his affection. While Loris pondered whether a sugar-coated apple and affection would be enough to forgive a betrayal, Pastry held it up and asked for trust again. Lost in admiration for her sugar god, she forgave him and thanked him for the gift. But before they could further develop a romantic story, the arrogant maid appeared, interrupting the scene and taking Loris away. Alone, Pastry found his new recruit, Niccolo, and was embarrassed when he joked about his reputation as a heartbreaker. To assert himself, Pastry called upon his second-rate owl, Susan, threatening to double Niccolo's workload and further reduce his salary if any secrets leaked. Back home, Pastry was immediately attacked by his mother, who wasted no time teasing him about his efforts to win the admiration of Loris's noble peaches. She only let him go when Loris appeared, but as he tried to grab Pastry to escape, the Queen of Gossip realized he must have brought too much spicy tea from the literal tea party. After some weariness, she helped him recover with another cup of tea, discovering that Pastry prepared special packages to send his favorite sweets as revenge on Ray Test, who had stood in his way of becoming a wealthy nobleman. When Ress heard this, she flew into a rage and began spreading rumors about her fondness for young boys. Her uselessness as an advisor didn't help matters, as Pastry began reading through some marriage proposals she'd received, most from children as young as 10. Meanwhile, Hubert's advisor, who looked like a Greek god, informed Pastry about the 30,000 strong Ludar army that would attack before Petra and Squall's official wedding. He made it clear that the cattle wouldn't sense the danger, and Pastry, frightened, wrote a letter begging for help. Meanwhile, Pastry explained to Fuel that he would use the money from his candy and photo sales to buy 100 goats, milk them, and make cheese to enhance his desserts. Fuel recalled that years ago, when goats were brought to these arid lands, they wiped out all the grass, but Pastry, ever confident, was certain that with the water reservoirs, that wouldn't happen. He planned to expand even further, bringing in chickens and cows. Counselor Bobo asked him if he really wanted to eat chicken, and Pastry challenged him to never touch his precious chickens, which were necessary for the eggs, the base of the cakes and custards, his true salvation. Afterward, Pastry dragged the counselor into another tasting session, showing off a new vegan sweet syrup he'd created. Fuel found it overly sweet, confirming that the puff pastry was perfect. Later, he dismissed Mark and Luminito for another session of unpaid labor while they set up a machine to extract more syrup. Luminito tried to reach the juicer's head, but Mark's weight got in the way, irritating her. As she squeezed his head between her legs, they tripped and fell, breaking the juicer's handle. After the accident, Loris used his creativity to suggest something similar to a wine press, an idea Pastry immediately loved. He rushed home to his father for help with yet another of his strange projects, but was shocked to discover that war had finally begun. His father explained that Hubert's neighbors, the Luddarauts, would send their army in a few days. The news frightened Pastry. A few days later, while Pastry prepared a white cream, his father and his men trained, sweating and speculating whether churning the cream for hours was a new, secret way to build muscle. Pastry smiled, explaining that churning did nothing for his muscles and that his diabetic diet, almost devoid of protein, angered Casserole, who insisted he take care of his health. Meanwhile, the Ludar army gathered in their tent, discussing how Hubert must have realized the 30 Zizan's strong army was a lie. They concluded that he hadn't asked for reinforcements from the livestock secretary, either because Cadillac refused or because Hubert felt too cocky. The latter seemed more likely, so now they would have to face only 10,000 soldiers alone. While they were strategizing, a soldier brought news that Squall was staying at the Huber house, which made the general smile mischievously. Loris entered the kitchen and tried to make small talk, saying that all wars could be avoided if everyone loved sweets as much as Pastry did. After all, they'd be too busy battling diabetes to fight. He won over the baker by promising a cheesecake as soon as his long-awaited goats were delivered. Later, however, all plans were dashed when his goats were stolen by another con man, who appeared to have devoured them all. The merchant explained that his men had threatened and forced Pastry and the goats to be sold to Casserole. Casserole, in turn, explained that they needed to accept the situation, even if it was difficult, because the upcoming war would make everything even more complicated in the coming years. Pastry, however, couldn't bear it any longer. He set out, determined to confront the merchant and give him a dressing down. But Casserole stopped him before he got anywhere. He reminded him that the Baron hadn't stolen the goats. In fact, he had paid for them, so even if Pastry went to the Baron's mansion and shouted, it wouldn't achieve anything. Casserole, cunningly, suggested they join Hubert's army as reinforcements. This way, they could move up the priority list for supplies and, at the same time, recover the Baron's goats. The idea excited Casserole, and Pastry was so excited that he seemed to have transformed into a legendary hero as he made his way to the army. Mark complained, saying he wanted to go along, but Luminito called him useless and weak, claiming he would disrupt the entire operation. Loris, on the other hand, was saddened by Pastry's sudden departure, but Pastry apologized, explaining that he couldn't stop thinking about the goats and the delicate situation. Meanwhile, Squall was screaming, imagining Petra and even visualizing her vivid colors. Just then, Ruber appeared, taunting Squall, commenting on how his lady's assassination skills had improved. The fun, however, was interrupted when a Greek god appeared, bringing news to Hubert about Luther's impending army. Despite the severity of the situation, there was a silver lining. The enemy army numbered only 10,000 soldiers. Ruber believed in victory and urged Squall to prepare to finally become a man and lead a unit on the front lines. Squall, who had never been on a battlefield, nearly panicked, but agreed, thinking he would impress Petra by showing off his military side. However, a cunning enemy with sharp teeth planned to attack him on the battlefield. Hours later, Pastry and Casserole arrived at Hubert's mansion to discuss the battle plan. Casserole noticed something strange about the enemy formation, but couldn't pinpoint the exact problem. Pastry then used his magical power, Mac, to understand the situation, discovering that the would-be attackers were in a defensive position. This led them to conclude that, if he were the strategist, he would use small units to set up ambushes against the enemy front line. At that moment, Hubert realized he had made a mistake, sending Squall into the perfect trap. Casserole and Pastry immediately rushed to try to save Squall, who was advancing into enemy territory. Soon, Ludar's army completely surrounded Squall's group. He realized he was practically lost, like meat ready to be smoked. His men asked for orders, and he tried to retreat, but soon realized that was no option. The only way out was to fight. Just before the confrontation, Pastry appeared to rescue Squall, who nearly wept with relief. After the battle, Squall held Pastry's hand as if he were a distant figure, silently thanking him, but was shocked to see all the soldiers killed because of him. Ludar accepted the defeat bitterly, impressed by Hubert's intelligence and Casserole's skill. Back home, Hubert celebrated not having lost his daughter and was eternally grateful to Pastry. Both he and his father exaggerated how heroic Squall had been, even though they knew he barely had any strength. When Petra appeared worried, Squall asked to be left alone, hurting inside. Ignoring the young woman's concern, Petra felt the weight of defeat. It was the first time she'd seen Squall act beyond trying to impress her, and she wondered how she could help him, even though she felt as helpless as he did. Casserole, more sensitive, remembered that Pastry had once helped Mark overcome his depression and wondered if she could do the same for Squall. Then she remembered Loris's words, "Sweets always win over complaints," and began preparing another masterpiece in the kitchen. Meanwhile, Hubert was throwing a grand celebration party, but Squall remained sullen. In the bakery, he prepared the dough, spreading butter over the apples to create the perfect dessert. Casserole tried to cheer him up, reminding him that his strength of character was admirable, even with its flaws. But Squall couldn't forget the bloodshed of the battle. Just then, Pastry appeared and touched on Squall's insecurity, praising his father-in-law. He was momentarily distracted when he received a plate of ting pie. Pastry explained that the recipe was inspired by Squall's worldwide failure. The pie was wrong because the creator forgot to spread the dough on the bottom, placing it on top of the apples. The result ruined the original recipe, but created something unique and beautiful. Squall, uncomfortable, listened as Pastry said that sometimes failures can create miracles as impressive as the pie. This made Squall reflect on his upbringing, where he had always been taught to never fail. Petra intervened, saying she was proud simply that he had returned safely, even with so many lives lost. They talked about jutsu and leadership, making Squall promise to strive to be better, but he ultimately ignored Pastry, inviting him only for a drink in the garden. Later, Pastry returned home with gifts collected from Dan Huber and told Fuel that his father had negotiated with the Duke to buy back all the goats, destroying what remained of the rogue baron. Seeing Fuel's expression, Cinderella felt a chill. When Casserole returned, he brought the dough to help teleport all the rescued animals, practically turning the poor village into a zoo. He even left with Alcacius for the capital, while Hestu hid her anger at Pastry and S's audacity. A few days later, Pastry fulfilled his promise to Loris, baking a cheesecake that she loved, and so ended Pastry's sweet adventures.